Welcome to the Incredibly Human podcast. We're doing another Zoom podcast, and today we have Anna Blakney with us. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
So you have a long list of credentials. I know you're an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. You also have a PhD in Bioengineering from the University of Washington. Needless to say, you're a pretty smart person.
I dabble.
Tell us about your field a little bit. What do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I develop RNA vaccines and therapies. So my specific research is on a specific type of RNA called self-amplifying RNA, which sounds very complicated, but it's basically just a fancy way of saying it's an RNA that once it gets into your cells, it can replicate itself. So what this means practically for us is we can use a much lower dose of RNA than typical messenger RNA like you would find in the COVID vaccines.
This is basically what why we wanted to bring you on here is because we want to talk about vaccines a little bit and just kind of the information going around. So I actually tracked you down because I read an article about Team Halo. What is Team Halo?
Yeah, so Team Halo was started as an initiative actually between the United Nations and the Vaccine Confidence Project. And so the whole idea is to get scientists and clinicians who are working on COVID-19 just connected to the general public, specifically over TikTok is how it started. So yeah, I got a call from them last year. I just started doing it really about a year ago now. And I think, they realized that we were about to have all of these approved vaccines, but there are so many people that didn't know what RNA vaccines were, anything about this technology. And so there's so much information, misinformation out there going around. And I think sometimes it just really helps to hear it straight from scientists who actually do the work. So That was the whole goal and initiative, is really to just promote vaccine confidence and literacy.
And I noticed too, like whenever I was kind of looking through some of these, some people kind of take a more serious approach with the misinformation. Yours is a little more lighthearted. It's a little more fun. You got, you're kind of dancing and stuff. What made you want to take that approach?
I don't know. I guess it's just that's kind of authentically who I am. So yeah, I think, if you talk to like members of my family, like I would always make them make like videos and stuff when we were on vacation. And so I think it's just kind of a nice creative outlet in that way. But I think on TikTok, I try to make it a balance. I guess I always say like, come for the fun, but stay for the science. So I tried to balance between, making maybe more entertaining videos and more informational videos and have kind of a spread and a range there. But I think also on TikTok, it's kind of like every social media platform has kind of a culture to it, right? So it's people use it in certain ways. And I think that was, kind of just what I experimented with and kind of what ended up working on TikTok is just being lighthearted and being myself. And, we can still like be silly sometimes and vulnerable, but also talk about scientific data.
Right. And I think, right now we need both approaches. I think it's something we need to also, especially with the young community, to reach out to them and not get too heavy. And unfortunately, so my wife, she's an ICU nurse, and she's witnessed the effects of COVID up close and personal. And nearly every single day, she is helping people who are on ventilators, and she's having to hold iPads up to family members so they can say their last goodbyes. So it's a heartbreaking and it's a very frustrating thing. And so before the vaccines, there was just kind of this helplessness feeling for a lot of the medical community. And, nothing was really working. By the time they get to the ICU, their lungs are very fibrotic and stiff, and they can't breathe. There's no oxygen exchange. And I say all this because the vaccines really started to give nurses and doctors hope. And most of the people on the outside of this field really know nothing about vaccine technology. We just don't know. We don't know how it works and stuff. So I don't really want to push like an agenda. I don't want it to feel like that way. I don't want it to be a anti-vax versus vax discussion. But at the same time, COVID is coming back, and my wife, these ICUs are filling back up again, and it's 90% unvaccinated people who are ending up in the ICU and dying and being on these ventilators. So again, I don't want it to be about dividing, but at the same time, we're seeing a separation, and it's between people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say this. Like, I mean, I've kind of reflected on my experience on TikTok and interacting with, so many more people across the globe than I normally would have, right? And something I've kind of realized in all of this is just that I think we kind of need to change our rhetoric about being pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. Like, in my experience, there's a gray area in between both of those where, most people actually are. And so, and we use language like vaccine hesitancy, right? And I think, actually it's not a bad thing to be hesitant about getting a vaccine. In my opinion, that's actually a good thing, right? You should be questioning what you're putting into your body. I just think we speak about it with such shame, and, there's just kind of this divide between people. But that's kind of one of my missions of being on TikTok is I don't feel that I'm there to convince people to get vaccines. I am there to educate people about vaccines so that they can make a good decision for themselves. And I think there's a very distinct mission there, right? It's a very different approach, because otherwise it's like, I don't want to get involved in this divide. I want it to be a place where people can come and have a discussion about anything at any point in time.
Right. And I think it's just, you're going to make more progress that way. If it becomes an us versus them, you're going to really close off a lot of people, and people aren't going to even listen to the information. And so we've been trying to advocate for nurses just because my wife's a nurse. And, I think it even telling the stories of what nurses are experiencing, what these patients are experiencing, there's still a hesitancy and there's still a mistrust. So yeah, that's definitely one that I kind of wanted to talk about. Why did you want to get in this field, and why do you believe in vaccines personally?
Yeah, I guess for me, why I'm so interested in vaccines and what I think is amazing about them is kind of going back to what you said about once people get to the ICU, they're really suffering, and it's can have really severe outcomes sometimes, right? And so for me, I think one of the best ways to approach healthcare in general is to prevent disease in the first place. And so that's the whole idea of COVID. And with these COVID vaccines, they're not perfect in preventing infection, but we know now that there's a really incredibly lower risk of severe disease if you've gotten a COVID vaccine. As you said, it really varies depending on where you are, but in some places it's 90% of the people in ICUs are unvaccinated. And so those statistics are so clear, right? Sometimes you do a scientific study or you get data and it's oh, there might be a difference there, but we need to apply some sort of statistical test to really tell the difference. But it's when it's 90% of people are unvaccinated, it's a clear indication that the vaccines are working.
Right. And that's something that I really wanted to push to is just we're seeing a result. If we weren't seeing that result, I think my wife has had one person who is fully vaccinated in the ICU, and that person has made a full recovery. So, but I know a lot of the mistrust is just coming from a lack of understanding. We don't know how vaccines are made. We don't understand what the process looks like. We don't, vaccines they come in the form of a needle, and that's unsettling. They're made in labs, and that can be kind of unsettling. So it doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel, it almost feels cold and sterile. And so it's natural to be suspicious about this type of stuff. But like you said, it's important to question what we put on our bodies, but at the same time, we don't want to have this false image of what people like you are doing. You're not evil scientists, trying to do something that's just bad for the world. It's something that you're wanting to do that's good for the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my whole motivation is to have a positive impact on human health. And I just think vaccines are one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah. And I think another reason that we kind of struggle with hot topics is just our own personal bias. And I know that we see constantly, I'm always reading just contradictory evidence and studies about vaccines and their efficacy and, these other pharmaceuticals, everybody's saying something different. And I think that's where a lot of the mistrust comes from. In your field and in studying this stuff, where is it possible to be biased? Do you feel like you ever experienced that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, it's something that I just have to really work on being personally aware and cognizant of, right? Because obviously when I see studies that are oh, RNA vaccines work great, it's like, I'm like, yes, like the field I work in is like being successful, right? But that's actually not how science works. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever that happens, it's like, I think you just have to have an awareness of it and then be like, okay, there's the headline, but let's actually dig into the data and see if I come to the same conclusion about this study. And so I think that's the difference is, most of the time, and I guess, something I also really try and do on TikTok is I actually will talk about the data and I try to post links to data as often as possible, because that to me is, I guess, where I get, my information from, right? Like, I don't want somebody else to interpret this for me. I want to see what the study was, like, what are the conditions, and evaluate it. I know that not everybody necessarily has the education or like level to understand that, like a peer-reviewed scientific article at the same level. I mean, there's often things that are outside my field that I don't understand 100%.
Right.
But I think it's really just digging down to like, okay, where is this data coming from? And I think one thing we just need as a society is to improve people's literacy about science so that we can all understand what these even mean. But you know what? I think a huge part of that actually comes back to educators and academics, right? Because if you think about back to January 2020, like right as the pandemic was starting, there were so many people, so many scientists who didn't even know what RNA vaccines were, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then to have like just, a year later, less than a year later, to have like 2 mRNA vaccines that are approved for emergency use, or authorized for emergency use, is just, yeah, it's of course, like people are like, what is this? Why have I never heard of mRNA vaccines? They've never been approved before. Of course, it raises lots of questions. And there's just this lag between what researchers are doing and what the public actually knows about and is aware of. Like RNA vaccines, I think, have kind of just made it to the zeitgeist for the last year, right? Like now it's like, that's a vocabulary word in like everybody's brain. But before that, it was like, there were scientists that didn't even know how these worked.
Right. But this isn't a new technology. It's not like it's
No.
not. That's one of the
Yeah,
misconceptions, is that people think this is just brand new, just rolling off the
totally.
table.
So yeah, this is, I think, yeah, I think the history is fascinating. I tried to get into that kind of as often as possible. But what a lot of people don't realize is RNA medicines in general have been in development for a long, long time. So 1990 was actually the first paper that showed that RNA could be used as a vaccine in vivo, right? So that was like 31 years ago now. So in the past 3 decades that we've been working on this, a lot of progress has been made. That's just what it takes to, make a technology. There were several, kind of landmark achievements that had to happen to actually make the technology work. But I think something that a lot of people don't know, there's kind of like two different like, I guess, clinical trials that I always reference that I think are kind of the best evidence that we have for these RNA medicines.
Mm-hmm.
So first is actually the first RNA vaccine clinical trial that was started in 2013. So that was a CureVac rabies vaccine. So, that means that we now have like 8 years of long-term safety data for people that have gotten RNA vaccines. Obviously, it's for a different disease, but it's very similar
Right.
formula that went into that. So when we say that we don't have long-term data, that's true from the COVID studies, but we do have pretty long-term data from other types of RNA vaccines. And so this is, comforts me that we have evidence that, there aren't any long-term effects that would be expected from it.
Right.
And the second is, so it's not a vaccine, but there's actually an FDA approved drug, which is called Onpattro. And this is a treatment for a pretty rare disease called amyloidosis. But the formulation that it contains is a very small piece of RNA called siRNA, formulated in lipid nanoparticles. It's almost the exact same formulation as the mRNA vaccines. And this was FDA approved in 2018. What's really interesting and why I bring up this specific treatment is that people have now gotten injections of it Onpattro every month for the past 3 years. So people have had like lots of RNA and lipid nanoparticles repeatedly injected into them. So I think not only do we have kind of this long-term data from RNA vaccines, but we have repeat dosing of these RNA medicines over time now. And these are in sick patients, right? These aren't in perfectly healthy patients. So I think there is a lot of evidence that they have a really excellent safety profile that most people just may not know about.
Right. So before we kind of go more into the discussion of the hesitancy, what is a very basic understanding of mRNA technology and what it's doing in the body?
Yeah, so how it actually works. So from a vaccine perspective, I like to think about what are we actually trying to do with a vaccine? So the goal of a vaccine is to train your immune system to recognize a pathogen, a virus, before you ever see it. So how do we do that? We need, there's a target that we're trying to target with the vaccine. So this is most commonly a protein on the virus surface. So for SARS-CoV-2, this is the spike protein, if you've heard of that. And there's many ways of introducing the spike protein into your body. So historically, we would just give you an inactivated virus, or the protein itself has been used for some platform technologies. But now instead, the downside of those vaccines is that they take a really long time and a lot of resources to manufacture at scale. So instead, what RNA does is, instead of giving you the protein, we give you mRNA, which is just the code for your cells to make the protein itself. Give you the mRNA that makes the protein, and then trains your body to recognize that protein without ever having seen the SARS-CoV-2 virus.
Right.
So it's kind of just a stepping stone. Like, we're giving your cells the instructions to make the protein, and that's our bioreactor, instead of making a vaccine in a huge factory.
Right. So we've come a long way in terms of vaccines, where we used to give even live viruses, back with smallpox and stuff like that. Have you had many conversations? Well, I'm assuming you have, with people who are very hesitant. And how did those conversations go?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love having conversations with people about this, which is, I think, why I like being on TikTok. But, I think most people, like, there's so much fear mongering that happens in the media. Like, you can just, every day there is a headline about a COVID vaccine in one way or another, right? And so and oftentimes, like, there is, side effects that come up, cases that come up that get highlighted, and people are just scared. Like, I think most of the hesitancy is just from fear, which stems from a lack of understanding. So I love people to come and ask questions. I would say the most common questions I get are really about the safety of these vaccines, which we already talked about, but also, were these vaccines rushed? That's the other question, which I think now I've started to see a little less of, because people kind of have started to understand the platform. But that was the whole goal of, one of the major goals of RNA vaccine development was as what's called a platform technology. So this is kind of a plug and play approach, where it actually, you can use kind of the same general approach for any infectious disease. So as long as you know that protein that you need to encode, it's really easy to make a new RNA vaccine. It takes about a matter of a week, right? So Moderna, for example, went from design to being in a human clinical trial in 66 days. Wow. So it's not that, it takes a really long time to develop a vaccine formulation. It's the testing and the regulators and the getting money to do it. And so last year was just a completely unprecedented global situation, right? Like never in, our lifetimes has everybody been paying attention to the exact same disease. And like I said, it's like scientists, clinicians, funders, regulators. And so of course, everybody was focused on one thing. And so it was just able to make progress more quickly. Whereas normally, like, think about all the applications that the FDA has or something like that, right? So there's lots of different things that are in clinical trials. It just takes time. So by no means were they rushed, but I think it's more of a collaborative effort that happened.
Yeah, I mean, when you've got something that's globally like this, everybody's pushing pause on all their other projects and say, let's make this priority. Going into some of these misinformation and posts and stuff like you're talking about, that's fear mongering. I mean, obviously, as somebody whose wife is an ICU nurse, we've naturally been saying stuff to our friends and family. We're sharing stories of what they're experiencing. So there is fear mongering when it comes to COVID, because it's serious. And but at the same time, we've seen the same kind of fear mongering when it comes to vaccinations. I've seen posts about people ending up in the ICU, having adverse events, people who are experiencing blood clots and miscarriages and stuff like that. And so these types of posts, they go viral, and a lot of people see them. And so why is this happening? Are people like allergic to vaccines? What's kind of causing that kind of stuff?
With any, medicine, there's always going to be side effects or risk of side effects, right? And so I think the way to frame it and the way that I explain it and think about it is that it's really this risk benefit analysis. And it's not just, I guess most of the time when we talk about it, it seems like it's very one-sided. Like, do I get the vaccine or not? Right. And when you think of it that way, it's like, okay, if you get the vaccine, maybe there's some of these severe side effects like blood clots or myocarditis, but actually the risk benefit, like what you're comparing is your risk of disease getting the vaccine or side effects getting the vaccine versus your risk of side effects or disease of getting COVID, right? And so I think what's really interesting is that in every case of even some of the more like severe side effects, right? So in the recent approval of the Pfizer and BioNTech vaccine, they do list a severe side effect that can occur. It's, I think, in about like 2 to 7 per 100,000 people get myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. This is a severe side effect. But what's really interesting is that in people that get COVID, it's about 10 times more common. So this is the thing. It's like, yeah, it happens naturally in the population, but also we know that this virus induces more of it. And so when you think about, okay, should I get the vaccine? What's my risk here? Should I get COVID? What's my risk here? That's the real risk benefit analysis that needs to happen. But I like to be really transparent about these things. Like, there are side effects to vaccines. Like, it is a risk that you take, which is why everybody kind of needs to decide for themselves.
Right. And kind of what you just said, that's what the medical community does with all procedures and medicines that they provide. It's a risk versus benefit. That's the approach in medicine. And it's unfortunate because I've even had conversations with the exact same thing, kind of what you just said. And what it turns into kind of so you're telling me that the people who have experienced this, maybe it's a miscarriage or a blood clot, you're downplaying their event, their adverse reaction. And it's not that, and it's hard to try to convince somebody who's so heavily and deeply invested into not wanting the vaccines to work. They want them to be, villainous almost. It's really hard to get past some of that. Have you experienced anything like that in terms of talking to people?
Yeah. And I think what you're getting at here is just kind of when people get caught up in like anecdotal evidence, right? And I mean, I also fall victim to this, right? It's really easy to be like, oh, well, my like grandma's neighbor like had this. And so I know somebody that had like a severe reaction and blah. But I think what's important and like why I think having a data-driven approach is really, really important is that really we shouldn't be just considering like what happened to your grandma's neighbor. Like, millions, billions of people have gotten these vaccines now, right? And so we have excellent data about what are the risks, what are the side effects, like what is actually happening. And same for COVID. Like, we know that lots of people have gotten it, and so it's really in your best interest. It's continues to circulate even a year and a half later, I guess even more. It's like coming up on 2 years of it now. And so it really is in your interest to prevent it, because it kind of seems like what's going to happen to get to herd immunity is you're either going to get a vaccine or you're going to get COVID.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, that's very well said. So again, some of the mistrust when it comes to vilifying vaccines and stuff and the people behind them is the idea of profiting behind vaccines. That's something I've seen circulating is there's that it was almost intentionally released to make profits for vaccine companies to actually make profits. What's something that you would say to somebody who says something like that?
Yeah, it's interesting. And like, I totally get the distrust of pharmaceutical companies, right? Like, even, I'm a citizen too. Like, I know like some of the more horrible things that have come from big pharma and regulation, or I guess misregulation historically.
Right.
I guess now, like something that people have to consider is that developing these drugs takes so much money. And you know what? We live in a capitalist society. That is just how things happen. It's not like governments are paying for these drugs to be developed. Like the companies have to make a product so that they continue developing things in the future. So I totally get the disparity. I would say it's kind of just an unfortunate reality, but I think if they were just giving it out for free, people would have just as much hesitations about it. Like, oh, why are you giving this out for free? Like, this seems so shady, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, and from what I've read, they're only making $5 to $15 per person or per vaccine. It's just the amount of people who are getting them that it's becoming very profitable. But
yeah, and I guess in my opinion, like I guess, we've all bought into capitalism more or less, right? And so I guess of all the companies that I think should be profiting, like I'm fine with a company that developed this in such a timely manner and is saving so many human lives. I think they deserve to profit off of that personally.
right, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many companies out there that we've never considered their profits before, and what are they doing to benefit the world.
Yeah.
Whereas this is something that truly is benefiting the world.
Well, which is an interesting point, right? So like I'm kind of speaking about this now in a very like privileged Western manner, I would say, where like, we live in a country that is able to afford vaccines, and actually way more vaccines than, Canada would need. But what I think is really interesting is that it's not like, it's not at the same place for most of the countries all over the world, right? And so I think there's really great initiatives that are happening now, like COVAX, which is really supposed to redistribute some of the vaccines from more wealthy Western countries to those that are in need and may not be able to afford the vaccines or have that competitive advantage or develop their own vaccines, right? And so I think that is really, really important, because you can't just we are not an island. Like we've seen how quickly this spread with, it's so easy to travel nowadays. It's accessible to so many people. Like we are a global society at this point in time. And so you can't just act like, oh, well, like we're all protected and that's fine. It's like, there's still so much exchange that we're not protected until everybody's protected. So I think those programs where it's like, okay, there should be a different model for countries that can't afford to buy vaccines at the same rate. And so I think, I would love to see more progress there as far as working with those countries and really getting the distribution more global. I think we can be doing a better job of that.
I've also seen posts and videos where doctors and even scientists and nurses are discrediting the vaccines. Why do you think this is happening?
You know what? I think people on social media can say anything, right? And so I think that's why whenever I post data or conclusions about things, I try to post where my source is from. And that's my advice to people is really, if somebody says something, I think it's we kind of just need to think about how we're consuming information. If someone says something that makes you think gets an emotional response out of you, right? Whether it's really good or really fear-based, think about that for a second, right? And I think in that moment, it's really important to be okay, where did this person get this conclusion? Why are they saying this? Is this an anecdote? Is this based off of one person's experience? Or is this based off of, lots and lots of data, and now we can make this conclusion? So I think that's a thing. It's the blessing and the curse of social media is that we're all so much more connected now. But I think we really have to have this attitude, I guess, as consumers of this media about, okay, we need to be thinking about this critically and take the information with a grain of salt if you don't know where it comes from.
Right. And so there's a lot of people who are in the middle and they don't know what to think. But then you have the people who are on the polar right and left, or you're for it or against it, that are extremely biased. And they're the ones who are spreading a lot of the information, but they're contradicting each other. And it stems from their personal bias and how they view and see the world. And so you get all these people in the middle, and they're consuming tons and tons of information that contradicts each other. And I think it just leaves a lot of them just very ambivalent and just kind of in a state of, I don't know what to think. I don't know what to do. So yeah, it can be very overwhelming. And I know a lot of people who are right there. They're very overwhelmed by all the information, and they're very overwhelmed by who do I believe, who do I not believe? This doctor is saying this doctor is saying this. And so I think, yeah, you're right. One of the things that one of the videos I sent you, and even somebody sent me, the doctor did. She brought up it was a little bit of fear mongering of what medicine had done unethically in the past to make her point. And so, like you just said, they used that as kind of a way to create a little bit of an emotional response and some distrust. And then she went on to kind of say some of the stuff that these other studies that she had found. But yeah, that's absolutely true. And somehow we have to understand that, yes, we've had these unethical things that happened in the past, but that's not necessarily where we are right this moment in today.
Well, and speaking specifically to that too, it's like, I acknowledge that there have been like atrocities in the past of medicine. Like, I do not deny that at all. But I actually think like we should kind of be grateful for those in a way, because they've informed modern medicine and the way that we regulate drugs, and why there's all this regulation and a process now. And it's still not perfect. We're always learning, but without that, like, it would just be the complete Wild West, right? So mistakes had to be made so that we could actually make progress. But that doesn't discount the fact that, like, this affects certain populations disproportionately. And, we shouldn't forget those things. We should acknowledge them. Like, I 100% acknowledge that there have been a lot of atrocities.
Oh, for sure. I mean, human history is just full of that kind of stuff. And it's also what has helped us evolve to get to this point. So how do we convince our friends and families and even communities to trust this vaccine, especially if they're young and healthy? But also, what if they've previously caught COVID? What's the benefit for these people?
In general, I would say my approach is never to convince people. I just try to have conversations about it, right? So that's my advice to a lot of people as well, which is like, as soon as somebody knows you're trying to convince them of something, they're just going to dig their heels in and get defensive, right? And so I think you have to approach it with like an open mind and be willing to listen, right? Like, okay, what are your concerns? Like, ask questions. But if people specifically have concerns about like, oh, well, I already had COVID, I don't need to get the vaccine. My general approach to this is, so right now we don't have what's called a correlate of protection. And this is just a fancy way of like, we don't know what antibody level, or, some other biomarker potentially, what antibody level you need to be at so that you don't get a severe disease. And so the goal right now is just to maximize the antibody level. We know that you can get antibodies to COVID after you get an infection. You do. We don't know how long it lasts, and it really varies based off of the severity of your infection. But what we do really know is there have been large-scale clinical trials done on people that had COVID and then get the vaccine. And in each case, they get a much higher level of antibodies. And so that really is the evidence for trying to maximize your antibodies. The higher those are, the less severe disease you're going to get. We know there's a very direct correlation now.
So you being in Canada and us being, obviously in America, y'all have a higher vaccination rate. What do you think is separate, and ours is, a lot lower. What do you think separating in terms of getting or inspiring people to want to get vaccinated that we're not succeeding on, that you guys did well at?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I've really enjoyed, so I just moved to Canada in January. Previously, I was in the UK, but I'm actually American. I'm from Colorado originally. And it's been really interesting to watch even those three countries, the vaccine rollout and uptake, because actually at the beginning of the year, America was absolutely outpacing Canada. The UK was doing pretty well as well, but it was just America was so on top of the vaccine rollout in kind of the early months of the year, I would say. Canada was slow to get started, but then once we got started, I feel like really proud on behalf of Canadians about how much everybody has mobilized. I want to say the last statistic I saw was like 83% of eligible people have gotten vaccinated, which is, it's just really incredible. Like it like makes me emotional thinking about how much like everybody has mobilized to do that. But I think, in the States, like they've had pretty good rollout as well, right? Like I want to say it's like in the 60s. Is that what you've seen as well? I want to say like low 60s is what I saw most recently.
Yeah.
Which is, it's really good. And you know what? I guess in my mind, like now the like tougher work begins, right? Because definitely in Canada and definitely in the States, we've plateaued. Like it's not continuing up at the same rate, like, just racing towards 100%. So now it's like, I think we just have to really connect with people that haven't gotten it, are hesitant, or on the fence, and just be there to answer their questions and have really open conversations about this. I guess vaccine mandates are one way to do this. Like we'll see how that ends up playing out in like all of these different situations. But I just think from an educational level, like now is the most important time. Like we've covered the easy people, right? But now it's like, now we really need to connect with people that are still on the fence.
Yeah. And that can be a very tough task at hand. Okay, so yeah, we kind of need to wrap this up. So we also want to educate people on this podcast, but we also want to really just discuss what it means to be human. So with that being said, and you being on here with us, what hope do you have for our world?
Yeah, you know what? I guess one thing that I've really realized from the pandemic is actually just how connected we all are, for better or for worse, right? From a spread of disease aspect, it's not great, but what we've realized is that, COVID doesn't respect our borders, and it really like infects everybody. And so I think it's just shown that like as humanity, like we're so connected, we're so similar. Like I think to me, that's actually kind of a positive realization that I've had from that. But I think, we have an opportunity now with the pandemic to really think about where do we want our society to go? It's a real opportunity to kind of pause and reset. And I actually feel very hopeful for the future about, some of the changes that are coming out of this that are really positive.
Very well said. Well, that was my last question. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and educate us and remind us, a lot of this valuable information, and hopefully it does some good for some people.
Thanks, Cal. Great to talk to you.
All right, so that was Anna Blakney, who's an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia and has a PhD in bioengineering. Make sure you follow her on Twitter and TikTok and Instagram, where she provides information on vaccines. And if you want to find out more information on vaccines, you can also check out Project Halo at teamhalo.org, where a vast collection of doctors and scientists from literally all over the world are working together to help educate us on vaccines.